March 8, 1971, Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. But the most expensive thing in that arena wasn't the $50,000 ringside seats. It wasn't Joe Frazier's $2.5 million purse. It wasn't even Muhammad Ali's $2.5 million guarantee. It was the chinchilla coat draped over Frank Lucas's shoulders, $125,000 worth of fur that glowed like a neon confession under the arena lights. Every mobster in that building turned their head. Every federal agent took notes. Every camera clicked. And in that single moment, that one flash of vanity, Frank Lucas signed his own death warrant. Here's what you need to understand. Frank Lucas didn't wear that coat because he was stupid. He wore it because he forgot the one lesson that kept him alive for a decade. The lesson his mentor, the legendary Bumpy Johnson, died trying to teach him. Frank Lucas had built the most sophisticated drug empire in American history by being invisible. He smuggled 98% pure heroin inside military coffins returning from Vietnam. He cut out the Italian mafia entirely and went straight to the Golden Triangle. His brand Blue Magic was so pure it killed people. He made $1 million a day. $1 million a day. And nobody knew his name. Not the FBI. Not the Mafia. Not even Nicky Barnes, the flashiest kingpin in Harlem. Frank was a ghost. Untouchable. Invisible. Until he walked into Madison Square Garden wearing more money than most people see in a lifetime. The Italians saw him. The feds saw him. And 40 feet away, Detective Richie Roberts, the only honest cop in New York, wrote his name in a notebook for the first time. But here's the tragedy. That coat wasn't just vanity. It was a declaration of war, a middle finger to every Italian mobster who ever called him to help. It was Frank Lucas saying, and he was right. But being right doesn't keep you out of handcuffs. Bumpy Johnson had been dead for 3 years, and without Bumpy's voice whispering the rules, Frank made the one mistake that separates kings from corpses. He wanted to be seen. Bumpy used to say, Frank forgot. This is the story of how a country boy from North Carolina became the most powerful drug lord in American history. How he learned the game from a dying legend. How he built an empire on discipline, silence, and ruthlessness. And how one night, one coat, one moment of pride brought it all crashing down. Because in the underworld, there are only two types of men, the ones who stay in the shadows and the ones who end up in prison. Frank Lucas chose wrong. Frank Lucas wasn't a kingpin then, he was a shadow, a student, a country boy from North Carolina, sitting behind the wheel of Bumpy Johnson's Cadillac, absorbing the gospel of the underworld one whispered lesson at a time. Bumpy Johnson was the king of Harlem, not the loudest king, not the flashiest, the smartest. He controlled every number, every dice game, every back alley hustle from 110th Street to the Polo Grounds. The Italians hated him because they couldn't buy him. The cops feared him because he never gave them a reason to move. And Frank Lucas worshipped him because Bumpy understood the difference between power and performance. But the king was dying. Heart disease, the kind that doesn't care how much respect you command. His chest hurt when he climbed stairs. His breath came short when he talked too long. And the vultures knew it. The Genovese family. The Gambinos. Every Italian crew in New York was checking their watches, waiting for the mountain to fall so they could reclaim the kingdom they believed was rightfully theirs. Engine humming. Cigarette smoke hanging thick. Outside Wells' restaurant on a humid July evening, Bumpy sat in the back seat teaching Frank the rules that would either save his life or get him killed. You see that corner, boy? Bumpy pointed through the window at a young dealer in a loud yellow suit, waving a pistol like a flag, diamond ring catching the streetlight. He'll be dead by Christmas. You know why? Frank watched the kid shouting at customers, drawing attention like a neon sign. He's making too much noise. Bumpy nodded slowly. The loud man dies, Frank. Write that down in your brain. The loud man dies. The silent man eats at his funeral. Frank's instinct was violence. He was a chainsaw wanting to cut down everything in his path. Where he came from, barefoot poverty in North Carolina, you didn't ask permission. You took what you needed. Let me handle him, Frank said. Send a message. Bumpy's tired eyes pinned Frank like a nail. That's your answer to everything, ain't it? Gun, blood, noise. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. Respect doesn't come from a gun, Frank. Respect comes from making yourself necessary. The man with the best product is the man with the power. You kill that boy, another boy shows up tomorrow. You control the supply, you control everything. Frank absorbed it like scripture, but he didn't fully understand. Not yet. He was too hungry, too impatient. He wanted the throne, the respect, the fear that came with being somebody instead of nobody. Bumpy continued the lesson, each word carved in stone. You don't dress like the money you make. You dress like the money you want them to think you make. The Italians control everything because they control supply. They buy from the Corsicans in Marseille, cut it, step on it, water it down to nothing, and sell it for triple the price. If you want to beat them, you can't play their game. You have to change the game entirely. How? Frank asked. Bumpy smiled, the smile of a man who'd figured out the secret to immortality but knew he'd die before he could use it. You find a new river. You stay invisible. And when they finally realize you're there, it's already too late. Frank watched how Bumpy moved through Harlem like a ghost. No flash, no noise, just power that didn't need to announce itself. While other hustlers bought mink coats and custom Cadillacs, Bumpy wore simple suits and drove a Lincoln that looked like any businessman's car. And yet, when Bumpy walked into a room, every conversation stopped. That was the lesson. Silence versus noise. Discipline versus hunger. Patience versus the desperate need to prove you'd arrived. But Frank was still learning, and Bumpy was running out of time. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant. Bumpy Johnson sat down for what would be his last supper. Frank was 2 tables away, watching the room, watching the exits, watching for threats that never came from the outside. The threat came from within, from a heart that had carried too much weight for too many years. Bumpy's hand went to his chest. The fork clattered against the plate. The king's face went gray. And before Frank could cross the room, Bumpy Johnson collapsed forward, his head hitting the table with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Frank caught him before he hit the floor, held the dying legend in his arms while the restaurant erupted into chaos. Bumpy's eyes were open but fading. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, and with the last bit of strength he had left, he pulled Frank close and whispered the final lesson. Don't let them see you coming, Frank. Don't ever be the show. And then the mountain fell. The king was dead. The throne was empty. Frank Lucas stood in that restaurant, holding the body of the only man who ever believed in him, surrounded by wolves who smelled blood in the water. The Italians thought Harlem would fall back into their hands like a ripe fruit. Frank Lucas decided they were wrong. The Italians moved fast. Within 48 hours of Bumpy's funeral, they owned every corner in Harlem. Guys in silk suits and pinky rings walked into black bars like conquering generals. They handed out business cards. They made polite threats. The message was simple, repeated in 100 different accents. Pay tribute, or you don't work. Kiss the ring, or kiss your life goodbye. Frank Lucas listened to their speeches, smiled at their jokes, nodded when they talked about respect. Then he went home and did the math that would destroy them. The Italians weren't gods. They were accountants. Expensive, lazy, greedy accountants skimming profit from every transaction. They bought heroin from Corsican suppliers in Marseille. The Corsicans bought from someone else. Everyone took a slice. Everyone cut the product. By the time that heroin hit Harlem streets, it was 10% pure, maybe 20 on a good day. Junkies had to shoot twice as much to feel half as high. The Italians charged premium prices for garbage product. Frank saw the flaw in their empire. They didn't control supply. They controlled distribution, and distribution could be eliminated. Bumpy's final lesson echoed in his skull like a war drum. Change the game entirely. Find a new river. Frank found his river 10,000 miles away, in the Golden Triangle where Thailand, Laos, and Burma met in jungle that produced the purest heroin on Earth. And America had conveniently placed 50,000 soldiers right next door. Frank Lucas boarded a plane to Bangkok with $300,000 cash and audacity that bordered on suicidal. He was a black man from North Carolina walking into a war zone with no connections, no backup, no guarantees he'd make it home alive. The Chinese Thai suppliers who controlled the Triangle had been selling to Corsicans and Italians for 20 years. They had no reason to trust an outsider. But Frank wasn't asking for trust. He was offering mathematics. The heat hit him like a fist when he stepped off that plane. The air smelled like diesel fuel and death. American soldiers wandered the streets in dirty uniforms, drunk and hollow-eyed. Helicopters chopped overhead. Gunfire echoed in the distance like constant thunder. This was chaos. And chaos created opportunity. The meeting happened in a warehouse that stank of raw opium and fear. Lueci sat across from Frank with dead eyes that had seen every con and survived every betrayal. 2 armed guards flanked the table. Nobody smiled. This was business, not friendship. "Why should I trust you?" Lueci asked through a translator. "The Italians have been our partners for 20 years. Frank didn't blink. His voice stayed level, absolute. "The Italians are middlemen. I'm the market. You sell to them, they cut your product and steal your profit. They turn your 90% pure into 30% garbage and charge 10 times what they pay you. You sell to me, we both get rich." Lueci studied him. Searching for weakness, for fear, for the tell that revealed a man's true nature. He found none. "How do you move it?" the supplier asked. "The Italians control the ports." Frank had already solved that problem. The solution was brilliant. It was monstrous. It was perfect. American boys were dying in Vietnam every single day. Their bodies came home in military coffins, sealed and draped with flags. Customs didn't inspect them. Nobody questioned them. The dead returned with honor and without scrutiny. "America sends its sons here to die," Frank said quietly. "When they die, they get sent home. In boxes nobody wants to open." The room went silent. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably. Frank continued, "I want to use the system that's already in place. No one checks a sealed military coffin. Out of respect, out of fear. That's your tunnel straight into America. Whether this method was entirely factual or partially mythological doesn't diminish its narrative power." Frank Lucas built his empire on the bodies of dead American soldiers. Boys who died in rice paddies became mules for poison. Flag-draped coffins that represented ultimate sacrifice became vessels for ultimate profit. Lueci finally nodded. "You Americans always find a way to turn death into business." They shook hands. The river changed course. The first shipment arrived in 1970. 50 kilograms of pure heroin, 98% purity, hidden beneath a soldier who'd taken shrapnel in Da Nang and would never see his family again. Frank's hands didn't shake when he opened that coffin. He'd already made peace with what he'd become. He branded it Blue Magic. The name was marketing genius. It sounded mythical, untouchable. And the product backed up the legend. Where Italian heroin required multiple hits to get high, Blue Magic was so strong that addicts overdosed from half their normal dose. Those overdoses became the best advertising campaign in criminal history. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Blue Magic will kill you if you're not careful. Blue Magic is stronger than anything on the street. Blue Magic is the real thing. Junkies lined up around blocks. Dealers switched suppliers overnight. Money poured in like a flood. Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. Every single day. The Italians didn't understand what was happening at first. Their profits evaporated. Their customers vanished. Their product sat unsold while something called Blue Magic dominated every corner from 110th Street to the Bronx. They held emergency meetings in social clubs and back rooms, testing this mysterious new heroin, analyzing it, trying to figure out where it came from, and they kept asking the same question. The question that would start a war they couldn't win. Who is the ghost? By 1970, Frank Lucas had achieved the impossible. He was the most powerful drug lord in America, and almost nobody knew his name. That was the genius. That was Bumpy's ghost whispering discipline into every decision. Stay invisible. Stay silent. Let the product speak for itself. His operation ran with military precision, family only. Blood was harder to betray than friendship. Brothers, cousins, nephews from North Carolina. Men who understood that betraying Frank meant betraying their own bloodline. He paid them salaries instead of percentages. Fixed income. No incentive to skim. No reason to get greedy. Everyone dressed like janitors. Everyone drove used cars. His dealers looked like bus drivers and grocery clerks moving million-dollar product in paper bags. Blue Magic dominated every corner from Harlem to Brooklyn. Twice as pure. Half the price. The Italians couldn't compete with mathematics. Frank was selling champagne at beer prices, while his competition peddled watered-down lies. $1 million a day. Every single day. Money so fast they stopped counting it and started weighing it. The FBI didn't know he existed. The Italians knew someone was destroying their business, but couldn't identify the enemy. Frank Lucas had won by refusing to play the old game. But Harlem had another king. A loud king. A visible king who represented everything Bumpy Johnson would have killed. Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes wore custom mink coats in summer heat. He drove canary yellow Mercedes with his initials engraved on the dashboard. He appeared on magazine covers under headlines like Mr. Untouchable. He was everything Frank wasn't. Loud where Frank was quiet. Flashy where Frank was invisible. Arrogant where Frank was disciplined. They met in a private room above a Harlem nightclub, the air thick with cigar smoke and tension. Nicky sat draped in jewelry, diamond rings on every finger. Frank sat across from him in a $200 suit that looked like any businessman's uniform. "You're making too much noise," Frank said quietly. "Noise gets people killed." Nicky laughed. The laugh of a man who believed his own legend. "You can't build a legend by hiding, country. People need to see you. They need to know your name. That's how you get respect." Frank's voice stayed level, absolute. "I don't care if they know my name. I care that they spend my money. The man they don't see is the man they can't hit." Nicky leaned forward, smile fading. "You're invisible because you're scared. There's a difference between strategy and cowardice." Frank stood. The meeting was over. "When they come for you, and they will, don't say nobody warned you." But Nicky's words infected Frank's thoughts like a virus. You can't build a legend by hiding. The empire was growing, the money was stacking, the power was absolute, and nobody knew his name. Nobody feared him the way they feared Nicky Barnes. The discipline started cracking. Small fractures at first. Frank bought a nicer car, then a bigger house in Teaneck, New Jersey, then custom suits from Italy. The invisible man was becoming visible, one purchase at a time. Success was its own kind of drug, and Frank was using. March 1971, the fight of the century approaching. Ali versus Frazier. Every celebrity, every gangster, every power player in New York would be there. Frank's wife Ava presented him with a gift wrapped in silk paper. When he opened the box, his breath caught. A chinchilla coat, full length, custom made. $125,000 worth of fur that shimmered like liquid silver under the light. "You've earned this," Ava said softly, her eyes shining with pride. "Let them see who you are. Let them see what you've built." Frank stood before the mirror wearing that coat. It felt like armor. It felt like power. It felt like the respect he'd been chasing since he was a barefoot kid in North Carolina. Every Italian mobster who ever called him the help would see this coat. Every dealer who doubted him would see this coat. Nicky Barnes would see this coat and know that Frank Lucas had arrived. But Bumpy's voice whispered from the grave, "Don't ever be the show. The loudest man in the room is the weakest man in the room." Frank's hand touched the fur. Soft, expensive, dangerous. Eva smiled. "You deserve to be seen." And that was the moment. The choice. The mistake that would cost him everything. Frank Lucas looked at himself in that mirror and decided that invisibility was loneliness. That silence was weakness. That Bumpy's rules belonged to a dead man's world. He wore the coat. He walked into Madison Square Garden like a king returning to his throne. The arena lights hit that chinchilla and turned it into a beacon. Every head turned. Every camera clicked. Every federal agent in the building wrote his name in a notebook for the first time. The flash exploded like a gunshot. The hunt had begun. The morning after the fight of the century, Detective Richie Roberts sat in his cramped office, staring at a photograph that would destroy an empire. The image showed ringside seats at Madison Square Garden. Ali and Frazier were blurred in the background, but in the foreground sat a black man in a chinchilla coat worth more than Roberts would earn in 10 years. Roberts circled the face with a red pen. "Who is that?" His partner squinted at the photo and shrugged. "Some pimp, probably." Roberts shook his head. Pimps didn't sit ringside next to Italian mobsters who looked uncomfortable in his presence. This man wore a coat that screamed power, and power always left footprints. But when Roberts ran the face through every database, every criminal file, every arrest record in New York, he found nothing. The man was a ghost who'd made the fatal mistake of becoming visible. The hunt began with mathematics. Roberts couldn't find Frank Lucas in the system, so he found Frank's world instead. Bank accounts under his wife's name. Businesses registered to cousins. Real estate purchases that didn't match legitimate income. He followed the money backward like a bloodhound, tracing rivers to their source. Roberts was patient, disciplined, methodical, everything Frank used to be before the coat. For months, Roberts worked in shadows, tapping phones that had been silent for years, following cars that led to legitimate businesses, watching a mansion in Teaneck where nothing suspicious ever seemed to happen. Frank felt the pressure but couldn't see the hunter. That was the genius of Roberts. He was hunting a ghost with ghost tactics. Meanwhile, Frank's paranoia infected everything. Every car that followed too long became a tail. Every phone call that disconnected too quickly became a wiretap. The invisible man had stepped into the light, and the light was blinding. He started carrying a gun everywhere. He stopped sleeping through the night. The discipline that built his empire began cracking under the weight of visibility. The breakthrough came on a humid night in August 1972. One of Frank's cousins, Turner Lucas, got pulled over on the Cross Bronx Expressway with $50,000 cash stuffed in a gym bag. No drugs, just money wrapped in rubber bands. The kid wasn't built for pressure. He wasn't built to stare down interrogation. When the cops started asking questions, he panicked. "It's Frank's money," he blurted out. "Frank Lucas. I'm just delivering it. I don't know nothing else." Roberts got the call at 2 in the morning. He smiled for the first time in months. The ghost had a name. From that moment, the investigation exploded. Federal agencies swarmed the case. DEA, FBI, ERS. They built their net one wiretap at a time, one surveillance photo at a time. Frank's empire, constructed on silence and discipline, started crumbling under the weight of its own success. And Frank changed. The pressure transformed him into everything Bumpy warned against. He got loud, violent, sloppy. When he suspected a dealer of skimming, he beat the man bloody in front of witnesses instead of handling it quietly. When suppliers raised prices, Frank threatened them with death loud enough for half the block to hear. The invisible king became a visible tyrant, breaking every rule that kept him alive. The family started fracturing. Blood wasn't thicker than a 20-year sentence. Cousins who'd worked for him since the beginning started weighing their options. Loyalty versus freedom, honor versus survival. Some stayed silent. Others made quiet phone calls to lawyers, testing the temperature of cooperation. January 28, 1975. The dawn raid came without warning. Federal agents surrounded Frank's mansion in Teaneck like an invading army. They didn't knock. They smashed doors with battering rams. Helicopters circled overhead while 50 agents in tactical gear stormed through his castle. Frank didn't fight. There was no glorious shootout, no dramatic last stand. He stood in his bedroom in silk pajamas while agents tore his life apart. They found $500,000 hidden in walls. They found heroin. They found records. And in the closet, still hanging like a trophy, they found the chinchilla coat. The arrest wasn't cinematic. It was humiliating. Frank Lucas, the most powerful drug lord in America, was dragged from his mansion in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their windows. Not a king, just a common criminal who'd forgotten the most important lesson. In his cell, facing 70 years in prison, a federal prosecutor slid papers across the metal table. "You have two choices, Frank. Die in here as a legend who kept his mouth shut, or live as something else entirely." Frank stared at the concrete walls and made his decision. 70 years. That was the number the judge gave Frank Lucas. Not a sentence, a mathematical impossibility. Frank would be 120 when he walked free, if he lived that long, which he wouldn't. The Italians had already put a $200,000 contract on his head. Prison math was simple. The loud man dies. The federal prosecutor sat across from Frank in a concrete room that smelled like fear and broken dreams. No threats, no shouting. Just cold arithmetic. You're 50 years old, Frank. 70 years means you die in here. The Italians want you dead. Your so-called partner Nicky Barnes is already singing like he's auditioning for the Metropolitan Opera. You think silence is going to save you now? Frank's first answer was absolute, carved in stone. "I'm not a rat." Those 4 words represented everything Bumpy Johnson had taught him. Loyalty is everything. Silence is survival. The man who talks is the man who dies screaming. Frank had built his empire on those principles, chosen family over friends because blood was supposed to be unbreakable. He'd stayed invisible because visibility meant vulnerability, and now they wanted him to violate every sacred rule. But reality doesn't negotiate with principles. Reality arrived in intelligence reports showing Italian mobsters sharpening knives with his name on them. Reality arrived when his lawyer explained that Nicky Barnes, The flashy king who'd mocked Frank's discipline had already started cooperating. The man who'd built his legend on being seen was now being seen in federal courtrooms, pointing fingers at everyone he'd ever shared a meal with. Days turned into weeks. The pressure mounted like water behind a dam. Every conversation in the yard carried the weight of potential death. Every meal might be his last. Frank faced the impossible choice that separates legends from corpses. Die in this cage as a silent king, maintaining honor that nobody would remember, or live as the thing Bumpy Johnson would have killed him for becoming. Survival is a drug stronger than heroin, stronger than pride, stronger than loyalty. Frank chose life, and life tasted like poison. The transformation destroyed him from the inside out. Frank Lucas became a federal informant, and every name he gave felt like cutting off a piece of his soul with a rusty blade. He testified against corrupt NIPT officers who'd taken his money for years. He testified against dirty DIA agents who'd looked the other way while coffins full of heroin passed through their checkpoints. He testified against Italian mobsters who'd tried to have him killed. His words became bullets that shot down over 100 men. The government kept their promise. His 70-year death sentence became 15 years. He served 5. But the difference between Frank and Nicky Barnes was shame. Nicky cooperated with pride, appearing on magazine covers, giving interviews, wearing his betrayal like another fur coat. Frank cooperated with the weight of a man who knew he'd violated something sacred. Bumpy's voice haunted every testimony. Every word spoken in those courtrooms was another shovel of dirt thrown on his mentor's grave. He tried to justify it during sleepless nights. The system had betrayed him first. His own family had started making deals. Nicky had destroyed the code before Frank ever opened his mouth. Everyone was talking. So why should Frank die silent? The rationalizations stacked up like bricks, building a wall between who he was and who he'd become. But in the quiet moments when lies stopped working, Frank knew the truth. He'd become everything he once despised. The invisible king had wanted to be seen, and being seen had cost him everything that mattered. Frank Lucas walked out of prison in 1981 to a world that no longer knew his name. His empire was gone, his money confiscated, his reputation destroyed. He spent his remaining years as a janitor and church volunteer in Newark, sweeping floors for minimum wage. The man who'd made $1 million a day asked God for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. He died on May 30th, 2019, at 88 years old, largely forgotten. The empire he'd built by being invisible was lost the moment he demanded to be seen. That $125,000 chinchilla coat had cost him everything. His freedom, his fortune, his honor, his legacy. So here's the question that should haunt you tonight. If you could have the world in your hands, but only by staying invisible forever, could you do it? Or would you, like Frank Lucas, eventually buy the coat?